The first one, for me, poetry has always been with me since the beginning. It's one of the first things I remember. I was a kid who learned to read. My mother insists that I taught myself how to read. She says she can't figure out how I got it, but she used to read stories to me. And by
Mm,
stories, I mean she used to read the simple stories that Langston Hughes wrote
mm,
about Jesse B. Simple. She used to read poetry to me, and all of these poetry books were in the house. So the Arnabon Temps, the Dudley Randall, the Claude McKay, the County Cullen, all of that was there. Langston Hughes's poetry, Zora Neale Hurston's work was there. And I learned to read using that work. And before I could read, she read it to me, as bedtime stories. So poetry has always been with me, and I wrote it in some form or another since I can remember. The Last Poets, Gil Scott Heron, Oscar Brown Jr. Those records were in our house, and I was what we called a latchkey kid back in those days, where
mm.
they just give you a shoestring with a key on it, and when you left school, you let
Yeah.
yourself in the house. You had your Swanson's TV dinners, and you did your homework and you watched TV. And one of the things that I had at the house always, from as far back as I can remember, were those records, those Last Poets records, those Gil Scott Heron and Brian Jackson records. And prior, my mother and father were members of Amiri Baraka's Committee for Unified Newark. So poetry was always there. And as I got older and a new generation of poetry came to be, so in the 90s, with Jessica Care Moore from your Detroit,
Hmm.
was on the Apollo killing it. And when the movies were coming out, like Slam, Slam Nation, Love Jones in particular,
Yeah.
I got even more into it when I realized, there was a whole scene that I could do poetry spots in New Jersey. And then from there, it graduated to doing poetry spots all over New York. We were in SOBs. We were in, not SOBs, we were in, what was that called? CBGBs. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Country Bluegrass, Country Blues, Country Bluegrass Blues, I think it is. CBG. It was
Okay.
a famous club for punk rock, but we were doing poetry there and doing poetry at the National Theater in Harlem, which is a historic site in and of itself, up on 125th Street. Everywhere, Brooklyn Tea Party, the Brooklyn YMCA, and I just got into it, and I had to do it. The first time I heard it in our generation, like live,
Hmm.
I I couldn't even just sit there the whole night. I had to leave, sit in my car, and work on poems so that the next time I showed up there, I would be able to do my thing too. I couldn't just sit there and not participate.
Wow.
I, it's all about, and we discussed this. It's about the whole concept of communication is not what I said, is what you heard, right? It's not what I
Hmm.
think I said, is what you heard. So it's about taking what's inside of me, right? Or inside of whoever is the poet in that occasion, mining it and giving it to the people. Like James Baldwin said, that the poet and the people have a very peculiar relationship. They don't always like the poet, but the power
Yeah.
of the poet is to dig deep inside and be able to translate what the people are experiencing, what the
Hmm.
people are feeling, and say that in a way that when the people hear it, they be like, "Yeah, that's what I was thinking."
Mm.
They couldn't
Mm.
necessarily articulate it like that, but
Right.
bang, you have given voice to what I'm feeling, and now they want other people to hear it. Almost by proxy, like this is what it's kind of like that Cyrano de Bergerac thing where like, this is what I was feeling,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
this person wrote it. Now I'm gonna give it to you, so then you could see, exactly what I would have told you had I had the words or had I been able to articulate, to a way to say it. So that's the power of the poet, not just myself. Any poet that digs deep, any poet that writes from their heart, and I've seen it. I've seen poets who have been who've been doing it for 10, 15, 20 years, rock crowds, and then somebody would get on the mic who hasn't been in front of a crowd ever, and
Yeah.
still take people further because that person gave voice to something unique, something sincere, something that the crowd was looking for, waiting
Yeah.
for somebody to voice. And that person who may not be a quote unquote professional, somebody who is the first timer, newbie, whatever.
Yeah.
That's the power of poetry, to speak the people's concerns and to articulate them in a way that when the people hear it, they want to stand behind that poem and show it to other people. Just two things. Number one, you always want to do your best work. And one of the ways to ensure you do that is you never force a poem, right? You let the poem take the amount of time it wants to take. Like babies, poems have gesticulation periods, and you want to allow it, whether it takes you one sitting. I've written poems just walking around, just taking a walk, and then I got a whole poem. And then there are other times where it takes me weeks or months, to
Mm,
put together a poem, but I don't force it. I let the poem take as much time as it wants to take. I might add little bits to it and take away bits from it, and keep going until I feel like this is what it needs to be. So I write a line. Everything kind of starts with that first line. And then I ask myself constantly, like, what does it want to be followed by? What
mm,
does that line want to come after it? And sometimes it was a particular poem I can think of called Scars, where every day I wrote a new second line, and every next day I was like, ah, no, that wasn't it, and then start
mm,
over again until I got to, in that poem, it was, I can tell where your scars are, just by the way you walk, and it was
yeah.
like, and then I didn't know where to go with it, and it was like, finally, it was like the next line was, and every scar I can tell where your scars are just by the way you walk, and every assault that you have endured has ensured your every step, so it's like, keep going and going for line for line. The second thing
Every
I would
time
say,
you say poetry, every time you start, right? Like it's like you get in this rhythm, this flow. Like it's powerful. I just want you to know how powerful your voice is, really.
thank
It
you,
really is. Yeah.
thank you.
So
Yeah, and the other thing is to always write what you know, because everyone has a story that, even if someone has a similar story, it's not your exact story. And even if
mm,
they tell their story, they wouldn't tell it the way you would tell it. So for you to tell your stories that you've lived and experienced, that you've even sometimes just observed, but you were there first person and observed them, for you to tell your stories and speak in the way that you speak, you let them come out of you the way that you like to talk to people. And
mm,
that's what I love. I love to hear poets speak, and you can hear the same way that they do their poems is the same way they're speaking to you. And that's how you know that
mhm,
it's authentic.
yeah.
So for a young person, I would say, like pay attention to how you speak, you
Mm,
know, and then think about your stories and tell them in a way that only you could tell them.
yeah.
And I think that is, that's what hits people. That's what hits people.